Yes, the average annual pay for a FTSE 100 CEO is around £5 million, which is about 180 times more than the average household's income. And that means in 2 days, they've earned the average UK worker's salary for the entire year. But why does this level of inequality matter? Well, it matters because, frankly, inequality reaches into almost all aspects of our lives. It affects our health, our education, our trust in others, and it even affects our economy. Now, I won't have time to talk about all the ways that inequality affects us, so let me just briefly run through a few, starting with health. Now, we've known for a long time that there's a strong link between a person's income and their health, and that health improves as you move up the income scale. But what we didn't know until more recently is that high inequality has consequences for everyone's health, including the very rich. So there's now a wealth of evidence that shows us that really all the way from cradle to grave, health outcomes are poorer in more unequal societies. Infant mortality rates are higher, life expectancy is lower, and overall levels of physical and mental health are poorer in more economically unequal developed countries like the UK. Then there's also the effect inequality has on our education. Living in a more unequal society means you're more likely to achieve poor educational grades, and research has found a link between lower average science, maths, and reading scores and higher levels of inequality. But perhaps the most important way that inequality affects us is in how it affects how we see others. So there is a substantial and robust body of research now that suggests that countries with higher levels of inequality have lower levels of trust, and that this lack of trust is associated with a variety of other social issues, including happiness, homicides, and health. So aside from the impact on your health and education, if you live in a more unequal society, you're also more likely to report lower levels of happiness, and you're more likely to be the victim of violent crime. Now, this issue of trust, I think, is really at the heart of why inequality is such a problem and why it is an important social issue. Because trust is really the glue that binds society together. And without it, it's very hard to develop and maintain the social and civic institutions that support us and that are so important to so many of us. Given inequality's effect on trust, it's perhaps little wonder that in more unequal societies like the UK, people take part in far less social activities like sport or community or religious groups. They're also less likely to take part in civic activities like voting. But if all these social effects of inequality fail to move you, then consider the economic effects. Now, for a long time, the prevailing thought was that inequality was the price we paid for a modern, dynamic, prosperous society. We were told that we could have a strong economy or we could have greater equality, but we couldn't have both. But in the past couple of years, evidence from the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank and the OECD has completely rubbished this idea, to be honest. Their studies found that not only is it perfectly possible to have strong economic growth and lower levels of inequality, but that more equal societies have more secure economies, they have lower levels of debt, and they are less likely to experience financial crises. And incidentally, if anyone doesn't just want to take my word for it and all this research, then you can find all the research on the Equality Trust website in our About Inequality section, which is my only shameless plug, I think, today. So clearly inequality is harmful. It damages our economy, it damages our society. But is it inevitable? Is it just the result of some people working much harder than others? Well, probably the simplest way for me to answer that question would be to talk about pay at the top. And just to ask you whether you think a FTSE 100 CEO in 2 days has worked harder than the average person does in an entire year. I think probably your answer is no. I hope it's no. Clearly, it's a ludicrous proposition. But to be honest, executive pay is it's a vast topic. It's quite a well-covered topic, and it probably deserves its own presentation. So I'm not going to talk about that. What I want to talk about instead is about people further down the income scale, and I want to give you an idea of how they work and how they're rewarded for that work, and then compare this to how those in the sort of top 1% are rewarded. So in our last report, which was called the Aspiration Tax, we looked at people moving on to universal credit, which is a new system of in-work support for low-income households. Now, the idea behind universal credit was that it would be a less complex. It would be less complex than the old system of tax credits, and And that would mean you would always be better off financially in a job than out of work, which seems like a good idea, of course. The people who receive universal credit are those in low-income households, with people going to work but earning very little, and as a result having their incomes topped up with support from the government. And many of them, despite working day in, day out, find themselves living in poverty. So what we wanted to look at in our report was just how hard those on low incomes would have to work for their money under universal credit, and how this compared to how hard our friends in the top 1% would need to work. So the way universal credit works is that those receiving it are entitled to earn a certain amount tax-free. Once they earn over that limit of around £192 per month, their universal credit then starts to be withdrawn. And the idea being that people can progress at work, gradually earn more, and as they do so, they'll obviously need less support, so they're effectively able to work themselves off of social security and out of poverty. Unfortunately, the reality is somewhat different. At present, universal credit is withdrawn at an extremely steep rate, with 65 pence of every additional pound earned after tax and above the £192 per month allowance being taken back by the government through universal credit withdrawal. Those receiving universal credit also lose 20 pence in income tax if they're earning over the personal income tax allowance of £11,000, and 12 pence then goes towards national insurance. So what does this all mean? Well, it means that for every extra pound someone receiving universal credit earns over £11,000, they only get to keep 24 pence of it. Now let's compare that to someone in the richest 1%, perhaps a FTSE 100 CEO. They don't get to keep just 24 pence of every additional pound they earn, or 34 pence or 44 pence. They get to keep 53 pence of every additional pound they earn after all taxes. So a low-income family on universal credit could keep just 24 pence of every extra pound they earn. A FTSE 100 CEO could keep around 53 pence. And my question at this point would be, who do you think is working harder for their money? I think this is really important because I think it shows two important truths. The first is just how hard many people on low incomes work. And if you want to suggest that the richest have earned their wealth through hard work, I think that's one thing. And I think we can all accept that many rich people do work extremely hard. But when someone on a low income gets up every day for work, knowing that they'll keep less than a quarter of their earnings effectively, but keeps going to work anyway, I think it's a bit much to suggest they're not working hard. And I think it's harder still to suggest the gap between their pay and a CEO's is solely about hard work. Excuse me. And the second thing I think it shows us is just how differently we treat low-income families compared to the rich, and just how different our expectations of them are. So on the one hand, we're told that the rich are hard-working, but in order to keep them, in order to incentivise them to work even harder, we need to cut their taxes. On the other hand, we're told that the only way to incentivise the poor and those on low incomes is to cut their support and effectively increase their marginal tax rate. Now that seems odd to me, because what we're saying, it seems, is that hard work is the preserve of the rich and wealthy, but at the same time, we expect those on low incomes to work much, much harder for their income. So the reality is we've created a hopelessly uneven playing field where low-income families are made to effectively sprint just to stand still, while the very richest see their taxes lowered and their income spiral. It's a system where the well-paid are seen as talent to be nurtured and rewarded, and the rest of us as a cost to be reduced. And it's a system that subsequently breeds huge inequality. Now, there are lots of reasons why we have this system and why we have these levels of inequality. There's technological changes, there's the reduced bargaining power of workers, there's changes to tax and social security policy like universal credit. But the myth that inequality is solely a result of the rich working harder than the rest of us is just that, I'm afraid. It is a myth. Thank you.